Chapter 9. Dynamics. The drama studio buzzed with adolescent noise, raised voices, chair legs scraping, and the unmistakable sound of someone drumming on a desk with a ruler. It was only Tom's second day, and already the room had that lived-in smell. Floor polish fighting a losing battle against sweat, cheap deodorant, and the faint hint of something dubious near the radiator. He hadn't said it aloud, but his teacher training school had been different. Not serene, not spotless, but disciplined. Behavior points meant something. Detentions actually happened. It had its issues. But no one had thrown a chair before registration. "Okay," he said brightly to his New Year 8 group. "Let's start with a warm-up game. Everyone in a circle, please." Some moved, some didn't. One girl yawned. Another kept her headphones in. Then the shouting started. Lewis's voice shot across the room. "Shaq, where's my phone?" Heads turned. Tom's instructions were already forgotten. The room shifted, the way it did before something erupted. Shaq stiffened. "How would I know?" "I saw you at my table when I was talking to Jaden," Lewis snapped, "and it was in my bag when we came into class." Shaq started moving toward him. "You calling me a thief?" "I'm saying it's not the first time things have gone missing near you." Tom moved toward them, raising his voice. "All right, that's enough. Both of you, step away. We'll get to the bottom of this, but not like this. Back in your seats, please." But Shaq didn't budge. "You'd better take that back." Lewis folded his arms. Or what? Tom stepped between them now. "I said enough." Shaq's voice rose. "Nah, I ain't going nowhere. I want him to say it again, and I'll drop him. I don't care." Tom froze, his heart thudding faster than it should. This was moving quicker than anything he'd faced before. George appeared in the doorway. All eyes turned to him. He looked at Tom. The younger teacher was rigid, his face pale, a mix of relief at seeing George and burning embarrassment that he needed him. "What's going on?" George said, his voice sharp. Shaq jumped in. "Sir, he's saying I took his phone." Lewis cut across him. "You were the only one near my bag." George stepped forward. "Enough." The word cracked across the room. Lewis flinched, and Shaq's mouth snapped shut. "Outside. Now, both of you." Shaq bristled, his shoulders still up. "But I didn't even—" "I am not debating it, Shaq," George said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just held the boy's gaze until the defiance flickered and died. "Move." The boys hesitated, exchanged one last toxic look, then followed him out. The door clicked shut. Inside the room, the silence thickened. Tom steadied himself, looking around the class. "All right," he said, voice level now. "Let's reset. Everyone up and spread out. We're starting again." Later that morning, Tom found George in the staff room by the coffee machine. "Thanks for earlier." George glanced up. "That's how it goes sometimes. They all carry a match. You just happened to be standing near the fuse this morning." "I trained at St. Augustine's," Tom added. "Behavior there was different." George gave a small shrug, not quite a smile. "St. Augustine's teaches you rules. Places like this teach you tactics." Tom half laughed. "Yeah, I know, bit of a culture shift. You'll adjust, but just remember, being liked comes after being respected, not the other way round." "Still," Tom said, "that was impressive. The whole room just stopped." "It's not magic," George replied. "Just time." He took a sip of his coffee, looking over the rim of the mug at the young teacher. For a second, the staff room walls faded, and George was back in a briefing room in Lincolnshire, 40 years ago. He was standing before 20 battle-hardened mechanics, 2 fresh bars on his shoulder, and a voice that felt 3 shades too thin. He remembered the sweat on his palms, the fear that rank alone might not be enough. He blinked, the memory fading. Tom wasn't incompetent. He was just new. "They carried on, by the way," George said, his voice softer now. "Arguing outside. I passed them straight to behavior." "Straight to the firing squad, then." I wasn't going to waste time talking in circles. I gave them an order. They hesitated. Now it's someone else's problem. He set the mug down. You can't save every lesson, Tom. Sometimes you just have to protect the peace for the ones who actually want to be there. Tom didn't reply, but George could see that his words had landed. Perhaps the old ways weren't done just yet. Third period had been a trial, a relentless symphony of half-hearted participation, questionable excuses, and a creative attempt to play a ukulele with a pencil. As the lunch bell faded, George sat at his desk making notes for the next lesson when a knock interrupted. Lottie stood in the doorway, bag in hand, her other hand hovering like she might knock again. "Miss Healy," George said, setting down his mug. "Punctual, a rare and admirable trait among your generation." She stepped in. "I said I would be." He gestured to the violin stand. "Well, come on then. Let's get started." Lottie set her bag down and approached the instrument with reverence. "Sir, is it true people used to play violins to get rid of rats?" George stared at her. Yes. They played so poorly the rats fled in terror, a technique I hope we won't be testing today. Lottie smiled and lifted the violin. George watched closely. "Remember to relax your shoulders. If you grip too tightly, you'll fight the instrument instead of playing it." He stepped forward, gently adjusting her fingers. "Curve them, light but firm. The bow isn't a saw, it's a brush." Lottie nodded and drew the bow. The note was scratchy, but recognizable. "Good. Again." She tried again. Better. They worked through open strings, each note steadier than the last. "Now the left hand. First finger on the D string. That gives you an E." Lottie copied. The sound was dull. "More pressure, not too much." She adjusted, and the sound came clearer. "There we are. Second finger, F sharp." They moved through the notes, George watching the focus in her eyes, that quiet determination. He remembered sitting with his father, bow trembling, struggling to find one clean note. "The violin doesn't respond to force," his father had said. "It sings when you guide it." They spent the next 20 minutes working through the basics, her concentration steady under George's watchful eye. At the end of her lesson, George handed her a book. "You don't need to buy one yet, just borrow this. First 5 pages only. Take your time. No shortcuts." Lottie accepted it with care. "Thank you, sir. I'll practice every night." George smiled. "See that you do." As she reached for the violin case, Lottie paused. "Sir?" George looked up. She didn't meet his eye. "Can I ask something?" "Of course." She paused for a moment. "Do you ever find it hard to concentrate here, when everyone's shouting and messing about?" George's reply came slowly. "Yes, sometimes I do." He stepped around the desk and leaned slightly on the edge. "There are always going to be loud voices. And yes, sometimes it might seem like they get all the attention." Lottie nodded, eyes still on the violin. "I just want to come to school to get better," she said. "But it's hard to think sometimes." George studied her for a moment. "It's a noisy school, but that doesn't mean you're wrong for wanting something quieter." He paused, then added, "Focus is a strength. Don't let the noise convince you otherwise. I've met plenty of loud people with nothing to say." Lottie looked up at him now, her shoulders a little lighter. "If there's ever anything you need, Lottie, anything that gets in the way of doing your best, you come and tell me. Doesn't have to be big. Doesn't have to be schoolwork. My door's always open." "Thank you, sir," Lottie said with a smile. "I will practice hard and see you next week." "I shall look forward to hearing what you've done," George said. "Just take your time." George led his final class of the day through a piece of music focusing on dynamics. He had divided them into sections like an orchestra, wood blocks on the left, shakers in the middle, tambourines on the right. "Eyes on me," George instructed, raising his hands. "I am your conductor. The piece starts with a crescendo. That means gradual, controlled. You are building the tension, not blowing the roof off." He signaled the start. The wood blocks ticked out a steady pulse. The shakers began a soft hiss, like rain on a window. Then came the build-up. He glanced around the class, and his eyes locked on Rachel Brooker, who was staring at her tambourine with deep suspicion. She then looked around, panic rising, and as she caught George's eye, she gave the tambourine a single, violent whack that sounded less like a musical swell and more like a shelf collapsing. George closed his hands into fists, cutting the sound instantly. The room fell dead silent. "Rachel," he said, rubbing his temple, "please cast your eyes to the white board. I haven't drawn that wedge shape for the sake of interior decoration. It starts thin, it gets wider. It implies a journey, not a sudden collision." "But I don't get the words," she said, throwing her hands up. "It's all Italian stuff. It's nonsense. Why can't it be in English so it makes sense?" "Because music is a universal language, and crescendo is precise. It implies a slope, not a cliff." Rachel stared at him blankly. Before George could respond, a knock at the door sounded, and Tom entered, grinning, pushing a trolley stacked with boxes. "Mr. Pembroke, I come bearing gifts. Saw them at reception. Thought I'd save you a job." George looked at him. There was a time when, unless it was a medical emergency, teachers taught and weren't interrupted. Apparently, that time had passed. "Thank you, Mr. Amory. Please leave them in the corner if you wouldn't mind." Tom parked the trolley and glanced at the whiteboard, seeing George had written crescendo and drawn a wedge shape. He looked at Rachel, who was currently glaring at her tambourine and muttering about not understanding. "Dynamics trouble?" Tom asked. "Just a disagreement about subtlety," George said, his voice level. "It seems we are stuck in a binary state, silence or noise, nothing in between." Tom nodded. He looked at Rachel. "Mind if I try something?" George hesitated. Then, eventually, he gave the faintest nod and stepped back, standing like a man watching wildlife, quietly and from a safe distance. Tom stepped forward, smiling. "Rachel, I want you to forget the Italian word for a second. Put the tambourine down on the desk." George raised an eyebrow. Surely she has to actually know the word before she can forget it. "Okay," Tom said. "Close your eyes. I want you to imagine you're standing in a long, dark corridor. It's dead silent." Rachel closed her eyes, self-conscious as the class looked on, not quite knowing where this was going. "Now," Tom said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "someone is walking toward you. They're 50 meters away. Tap the desk with one finger to show me their footsteps." Rachel tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Quiet. Barely there. "Good," Tom said. "Now they're walking closer. They're 20 meters away. They're getting bigger." Rachel added a second finger. The tapping got firmer. Tap, tap, tap. "Closer," Tom urged. 10 meters. They're running now. They're coming right for you." Rachel was using her whole hand now, the rhythm getting heavier, louder, more urgent, but steady. 5 meters. They're right in your face." Bang, bang, bang. "And stop!" Tom shouted. Rachel froze. The room was silent. Tom grinned. "Open your eyes. That feeling, that steady build-up of someone getting closer, that is what that shape on the board means." Rachel looked at her hand, then at the board. "Oh, like a movie scene?" "Exactly like a movie scene. It's not just getting louder, it's something arriving." Tom straightened up. He stepped back from the desk, leaving the floor clear, and gave a respectful nod to signal he was done. "Well done, Rachel, and thank you, Mr. Amory," George said, stepping back in. "Let's see if you can translate that movie scene back to the tambourine. From the top, watch my hand." He counted them in. The moment the music started, Rachel didn't whack it. She started with a shimmer, watching George's hand rise, matching the intensity, letting the sound grow until the climax of the first bar. "Much better," George said, lowering his hands. "Much better." "See?" Rachel grinned, tapping the tambourine. "I told you it was the Italian word's fault." "It is not the fault of the language, Rachel," George said, his voice clipping the laughter short. "And the terminology is non-negotiable." The grin slid off Rachel's face. George turned back to the board, uncapping his pen. "Let's remember that in the exam you cannot write a man running down a corridor. The term is crescendo. Do not forget it." He tapped the board twice, underlining the word. Chapter 10. The War Room. The front door clicked shut, sealing out the sharp evening chill. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of warm light and the rich, savoury smell of beef stew bubbling on the hob. George set down his briefcase, letting out a long, slow exhale. "You're home," Margaret called from the kitchen. "You're earlier than usual. Did you escape?" George hung up his coat, taking a moment to rub the stiffness from his neck. "Let's just say I made a strategic withdrawal while the enemy was distracted." He walked into the kitchen. Margaret was at the stove, bathed in the yellow glow of the extractor fan light. She turned, offering him a smile that softened the hard edges of the day. "Tea?" "Please." He crossed the room to press a kiss to her cheek, then leaned back against the worktop, rubbing a hand over his face. "I was ambushed by Tom Amory this morning. He pitched a joint project, linking football to drama and music. It was surprisingly coherent." "High praise from you," Margaret noted, reaching for the kettle. "Swaby also liked it," George continued, a trace of bitterness creeping in. "Mostly because he thought it came with a press release attached. The man is just a wind-up toy. Turn the key, point him in the right direction, and off he clatters." Margaret poured the boiling water, steam rising around her. "Better a wind-up toy than a loose cannon, surely? At least you know where he's going." George gave a non-committal grunt. Reliable and replaceable are not the same thing. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head to dislodge the thought of Swaby. He refused to let the day job drain him. He needed a clear head for tonight. "How was the cafe?" he asked, shifting the subject. Margaret handed him his mug. "Busy. We had a woman in this afternoon, sat by the radiator for an hour, looking like she was holding the weight of the world on her shoulders." George blew on his tea, listening. "Her son's been excluded again," Margaret said softly. "He's angry and lashing out. His dad left 6 months ago, and the boy doesn't know what to do with the silence in the house." She looked at George. "That kind of anger isn't malice. It's just pain with nowhere to go." She leaned back against the sink, her expression serious. "It made me think. That is exactly where the school comes in. It can't just be for the ones who already know how to play an instrument. It has to be for the ones who need a reason to pick one up." George nodded slowly. "I agree. It's not about turning them into concert pianists, Margaret. It's about giving them something that belongs to them. A discipline, a voice, a safe space." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "Speaking of which, I spoke to Father Brendan at St. Jude's today. If everyone is free this Saturday, we can go and look at the hall. He's very keen." George straightened up. "Really?" "Really. He said he'd love see the place filled with music rather than gathering dust." George let out a long breath, then a slow smile spread across his face. "I know it looks a bit run down," he said, half to himself. "But if the bones are solid, it could work. It could actually work." "It's a start," Margaret agreed, watching him with a look of quiet pride. She gave the stew a final stir. "Now, let's get some food inside you. The others will be here at 7, and you can't start a revolution on an empty stomach." 2 hours later, the living room had been transformed into a war room, albeit one with floral curtains and a roaring fire. Grimshaw had claimed the armchair, looking like a dishevelled monarch. Bob was nursing a mug of tea by the fire, while Mackenzie was leaning over the coffee table, arranging a series of index cards like a general plotting a campaign. "So," Bob said, "day 2, George. Survival or triumph?" "Let's leave the day job at the gate," George said, loosening his tie and offering a tired smile. "Tonight is about the future." Grimshaw leaned forward, holding up hands that were stained an alarming shade of cyan. "Speaking of the future," he announced theatrically, "I have battled the demons of technology. I fought the photocopier, and though it wounded me," he wiggled his blue fingers, "I emerged victorious." "What did you do?" Mackenzie asked, eyeing the stains. "It looks like you strangled a smurf." "A toner explosion," Grimshaw admitted breezily. "Collateral damage in the pursuit of excellence. Behold." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a stack of paper, fanning them out on the coffee table like a winning hand of poker. George picked one up. It was impressive. Heavy, glossy paper, a clean, minimalist design with a black-and-white photograph of an empty stage, a single music stand bathed in light. The text was sharp and understated. Inspire, create, belong. George's School of Musical Excellence. Bob let out a low whistle. Grimshaw, this is actually good. I am a man of many layers, Bob, like an onion, or a very complex trifle. Grimshaw grinned, looking visibly pleased with himself. It's professional, Mackenzie agreed. It makes it feel real. George ran his thumb over the text and looked up. Good work, Grimshaw. Thank you for this. Grimshaw gave a small, satisfied nod, the theatrics momentarily set aside. Right, George said, putting the flyer down gently. Let's get to work. Margaret has secured a viewing of the St. Jude's Church Hall for Saturday morning. St. Jude's? Bob nodded. It's solid. Might be drafty in the winter, but nothing a few portable heaters won't fix. If we agree the hall is right for us, are you okay to handle the logistics? George asked. The keys, the heating, dealing with the caretaker? Bob nodded. Leave it with me. I'll also look into the dull but necessary bits. Insurance, safeguarding, health and safety. DBS checks, the lot. If we're doing this, we do it properly. Thank you, George said. I was hoping you'd say that. He turned to the armchair. Grimshaw, you've done a great job on the flyer. How do you feel about handling the advertising? Grimshaw tapped his chin, a thought forming. Well, here's an idea. I'm down at the Rec this Saturday watching my great-nephew play for the local under-10s. He sat up straighter. I could head down there, take a big tin of sweets for the team at half-time, wins the kids over instantly. Then, while they're all sugared up, I hit the parents with the flyers. Mackenzie raised an eyebrow. You're going to walk around a public park offering sweets to children. You realize that sounds less like a recruitment drive and more like a police caution waiting to happen? It's called strategy, Mackenzie, Grimshaw retorted, unbothered. You underestimate the desperation of the football parent. They're freezing, they're bored, and they are praying for their child to find a hobby that involves central heating. I'm not a suspect. I'm a lifeline. George raised an eyebrow. Just keep a low profile. Didn't you say the last time you went, you got a telling off from the referee? It was a misunderstanding, Grimshaw said, waving a hand dismissively. I merely pointed out that his decision-making was inconsistent. Turns out, he didn't appreciate the feedback. Margaret cleared her throat gently from the corner. Let's not get sidelined, she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. Assuming Grimshaw manages to stay on the right side of the law, we need to talk about what happens when the students actually walk through the door. You can't just wing it. Mackenzie tapped his notebook, a solution already forming. Then we don't run it as a drop-in. We run it as a structured course. 10-week blocks, termly intakes only. Parents sign up for the full term. If they miss the start date, they go on a waiting list. It creates commitment. But we can't take on 40 new beginners every term, Bob pointed out. We'd drown. We won't, Mackenzie countered. The new intake is just to backfill the dropouts, but over time, the groups can expand. As the core students improve, we use them. Peer-to-peer learning. The grade 3s help the grade 1s. It reinforces their own learning, builds a community, and allows us to increase the class sizes without losing control. I like it, George said, nodding. He leaned back, lacing his fingers together. Which brings us to the question of money. We need to keep the lights on. Weekly subs, Grimshaw suggested. Pay on the door. I think that's the best option, George said. The others nodded in agreement. But it has to be low, accessible to everyone, just enough to cover the weekly costs. He looked at each of them in turn, shifting gears. However, before we take a single coin at the door, we have to actually open it. To pay the initial insurance, print the materials, maybe buy a few music stands and some entry-level instruments, we need a float. He paused. It's going to require a small financial contribution from each of us. Nothing drastic, just enough to start the engine. Bob nodded slowly. I can manage that. I'm in. Mackenzie closed his notebook decisively. Count me in. Grimshaw shrugged. I suppose I can delay the purchase of my new velvet jacket. For the greater good. Right, Bob said, leaning forward. So we have a structure, we have a syllabus, we have a float. He looked around the circle, his expression sobering. But George, even if we scrape our pennies together, it won't be enough to buy 40 instruments. That's a major investment. I know, George said, his voice level. Hardware is the biggest hurdle, which is why I have a separate plan for that. I'm going to speak to Swaby on Monday, George announced. There is a cupboard at school full of instruments gathering dust. I intend to ask him to loan them to us. Mackenzie looked skeptical. You think he'll agree to hand over school property for a private venture? It's not a private venture, George corrected. It's community outreach. The man is obsessed with widening access. Or at least he is when the governors are listening. I intend to leverage that. Grimshaw grinned, tapping his nose. The trick will be making him think it was his idea in the first place. Exactly, George said. He can take the credit. He can have the photograph, the quote, the whole performance. All I want is the key to that cupboard. It's a bold move, Bob said, shaking his head with a begrudging smile. You're a dangerous man when you want to be, George. I'm a desperate one, George corrected, and I want those instruments played. And for the long term, Margaret added from the corner, her voice practical, I can look into grants, the Arts Council, local business initiatives. If we can prove this works with the borrowed instruments, we can apply for funding to buy our own, but that takes time. Exactly, George said. Swaby is the shortcut. The grants are the future. Margaret leaned forward, the firelight catching her glasses. And if we do secure the hall and we get the instruments, why not ask Father Brendan about a Christmas carol concert? Let the students play a few pieces, maybe a raffle. It's something to aim for. George's face lit up. That's a brilliant idea, Margaret. A target. The conversation eased into a softer rhythm. Around the room, you could feel it. No longer just ideas tossed into the air, but something settling, gaining weight, gaining shape. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was the beginning. Chapter 11, St. Jude's. St. Jude's Church Hall stood like an old soldier on the edge of retirement. Morning light streamed through its tall, arched windows, casting long beams across wooden floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The walls bore the quiet scars of time, patchy repairs battling stubborn water stains, as if the building couldn't decide whether to stand proud or surrender to decay. Near the entrance, a weary bulletin board clung stubbornly to the past. Faded posters for bake sales, spring fairs, and choir recitals curled at the edges, the ink ghosting away as if even the paper had begun to forget. Waiting just inside the heavy wooden doors stood Father Brendan, a wiry figure in a well-worn clerical collar, his spectacles balanced precariously on the bridge of his nose. He had been the vicar of St. Jude's for as long as anyone could remember, a fixture of the village, and a man who could speak with absolute authority on any subject without letting a single fact get in the way. He greeted the group with an enthusiasm that wavered somewhere between warmth and salesmanship. Ah, my dear friends, he beamed, rubbing his hands together, as if the very sight of them had made his morning. Welcome, welcome. Come in. Mind the step. It's still a bit wobbly since the Harvest Festival incident of '09. He ushered them inside with the air of a man revealing a grand estate rather than a slightly battered church hall. Now, I must say, I'm delighted you're considering St. Jude's for your music school. She's got a few years on her, yes, but good bones, as they say. A bit of polish, a touch of life. That's all she needs. Then, lowering his voice as if sharing a great secret, he added, and might I add, I can offer you a very reasonable rate. Bob caught Mackenzie's eye. A silent look passed between them, the universal expression of two men who knew that a bit of polish was code for a month of hard labor. He straightened his collar with a hint of pride. I've even got a bit of musical experience myself, you know. Led the church choir once upon a time. He sighed, shaking his head. Until the numbers dropped, of course. Can't recruit them like we used to. Everyone leads such busy lives these days. Margaret offered a sympathetic smile. That's a shame. A good choir can bring so much life to a place. Oh, absolutely. The rafters used to positively thrum, my dear. Weddings, harvest suppers, the Gilbert and Sullivan Society. It was a hub, a veritable hub. But alas, the modern world has distracted the flock. The hall has been resting, waiting for a second wind, you might say. "It is a fine hall, Father Brendan," George said, "and we appreciate you letting us take a look." "Fine, my dear George, it is a sleeping giant." Father Brendan clapped his hands, the sound echoing a little too sharply in the empty space. "Come, let me give you the grand tour. You really must see the stage from the proper angle." He bustled forward, his cassock swirling. George exchanged a look with the others, a mixture of amusement and resignation, and they followed. "Now," Brendan said, sweeping an arm toward the main floor. "Note the expanse. The ventilation is superb. We get a delightful cross breeze in January. Keeps the mind sharp." "And the fingers frozen," Bob murmured to Mackenzie. "It builds character," Mackenzie replied, offering a dry half-smile. He stepped into the center of the room and clapped his hands once, a sharp crack that lingered in the air for a second before fading. He nodded, satisfied. "Decent decay. The sound clears fast. The brass won't smother the strings in here." "Precisely," Brendan chimed in, seizing the point. "The acoustics are cathedral-like. I once delivered a sermon on humility from this very spot that could be heard in the car park." Grimshaw wandered over and tapped a support column. "I like it. Old-school charm. You can practically hear the ghosts of past performances cheering us on." Brendan beamed. "Oh, the place is positively soaked in history. Why, the Gilbert and Sullivan Society trod these boards for 40 years. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the Pirates of Penzance." Bob raised an eyebrow. "Grimshaw, if we start hearing actual voices, I'm out." Margaret had moved to the window, running a finger along the sill. She gazed up at the light streaming in. "It's bright and open. Feels like a great space for teaching." "And the side rooms," Brendan added, gesturing to the doors lining the back wall. "Ideally sized for, well, whatever you need. Private tuition, meditation, storage for the more unruly tuba players." George nodded, beginning to map out the room with slow, deliberate gestures, ignoring Brendan's commentary. "Bob, percussion over there. Mackenzie, woodwinds and brass in that corner. Strings along this side. Grimshaw, piano and guitars by that wall. Group rehearsals in the center." He walked toward the worn stage at the far end, its edge chipped and marked by years of heavy use. "And this," George said softly, "is where it all comes together. Recitals, community concerts." A small smile formed. "One day, concerts will fill every seat." "And here," Father Brendan announced, stepping toward the corner with the air of a magician revealing a tiger, "is the pièce de résistance." He gestured grandly to the tired upright piano. "She's a vintage model, a little temperamental perhaps, but full of character." George walked over and pressed a key. A discordant clang rang out, resonating through the hall like a dying breath. Grimshaw winced. "That piano sounds like it's auditioning for a haunted house." "She just needs warming up," Brendan insisted, though his smile faltered slightly. "Like all great divas, she doesn't perform on demand." Laughter rippled through the group. George turned to the vicar. "Father, would you mind giving us a moment? We just need to put our heads together, weigh up the scale of the work and see if it's feasible for us." "Oh, goodness, yes," Brendan said, backing away. "I shall leave you to your deliberations. I'll be just outside pruning the roses, or looking at them at least." He bustled out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving a sudden silence in his wake. George looked around again. "I know it looks rough," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet. "The damp needs treating. The skirting boards are rot, and I suspect that radiator hasn't seen hot water since the 90s. He turned to face them, his expression determined. "But paint is cheap. Wood can be replaced. And if the boiler is dead, we work around it. We bring in portable heaters. The point is, the space is here. It's ours. No interference, no targets, just music." He paused, looking at each of them. "So, are we in?" Bob was the first to nod. "Yeah, let's do this." "Let's bring it back to life," Grimshaw added with a smile. Mackenzie looked at George. "I'm in." Margaret's eyes still lingered on the crumbling skirting boards, the rusted radiator, the speckled light from the high windows. It's going to be hard work. No shortcuts and no illusions. But yes, this place has potential, and it deserves better than to die quietly. Taking one last long look around, George turned back to them. "Right then, let's go and find the vicar. If the price is right, we take it." With that, they stepped outside, letting the heavy doors of St. Jude's close behind them with a resonant thud, less like an ending, more like the first note of something new. Father Brendan popped up from a rose bush near the path the moment they emerged. "So, my friends," he clapped his soil-dusted hands together, "what is the verdict?" George exchanged a glance with the others before offering a polite smile. "If the rent is reasonable, we'd love to take it." The vicar's eyes twinkled. "Well, I've given it some thought, and I believe we can agree on a very fair arrangement. Let's say £20 per week." "More than reasonable," Mackenzie agreed quickly, before Brendan could change his mind. Father Brendan spread his arms grandly. "It's not about the money. It's about keeping this place alive, filling it with purpose again. And of course, I'll be here if you ever need my expertise." "We appreciate that, Father," George said, extending a hand. "It means we can keep subs low and make it accessible." The handshake was firm, Father Brendan's satisfaction unmistakable. "Wonderful. I'm looking forward to working with you all." As the vicar returned to his roses, George turned to the group. "We've got the hall. Now we need a plan. Let's meet tomorrow at the Rose and Crown. 6 o'clock? "We'll be there," Bob confirmed. As they walked away toward the car park, Bob leaned toward Grimshaw. "Step 1, fix the hall. Step 2, make sure Father Brendan's help doesn't mean twice the work for us." Grimshaw smirked. A noble challenge. Chapter 12. The Plan. The Rose and Crown was quieter than usual. A soft rain tapped against the dark windows, sealing the warmth inside. Their corner table held a clutter of half-empty glasses, notepads, and a tape measure Bob had optimistically brought along. George and Margaret sat with a printout of the church hall's floor plan, already marked with George's unmistakable, blocky handwriting. Mackenzie had a notebook of neatly ordered priorities, cleaning jobs, safety checks, and a few tentative dates. Bob had brought a spreadsheet outlining proposed costs, legal necessities, and worst-case scenarios. Grimshaw had brought himself and a pen that didn't work. "We need portable heaters," George said, tapping a circle on the plan. "And the windows won't open," Mackenzie added. "Not properly. We'll need to get a few working, for ventilation at least." Bob scanned his list, his finger tracing the columns. Heavy-duty gloves, socket covers, 2 new fire exit signs, industrial cleaner, wire brushes, gaffer tape, mould treatment, bin bags, first aid refills, dust sheets, and a long-handled scraper. That should be enough to start. Grimshaw raised an eyebrow over his drink. "Heavy-duty gloves? What are you expecting to find?" Bob didn't look up. "I've met mildew with less menace than what's growing behind that piano." "Maybe it's a sentient music teacher," Grimshaw mused, "trapped in spore form, waiting for a host." George gave him a flat look. "Unless it can teach grade 3 theory, it goes in the bin." He turned back to the floor plan. "All right. Next Saturday, 10 o'clock sharp. We'll work top to bottom, one section at a time. Back room first. Strip it out, sort what's salvageable, and bin the rest." Grimshaw leaned back, chair creaking. "We should film some of it. Social media's full of those watch this wreck become a wonder clips. Could be good for outreach. People love a transformation montage." Mackenzie gave him a withering look. "You planning to edit a time-lapse of Bob sweeping?" "You'd be surprised what people watch," Grimshaw insisted. "I watched a video of someone revamping their lawn for 40 minutes last night. It was strangely hypnotic." George muttered, "If I see you filming me shifting chairs, I'll bury your phone under that lawn." Bob gave a dry chuckle. "I'll add a spade to the list. Just make sure you bury the phone deep enough. Grimshaw's the type to dig it up and live stream the resurrection." Margaret looked up from her notes, a patient smile on her face. "Joking aside for a minute, What we're offering needs to be real. If someone walks through those doors and it doesn't look professional, we lose them." George looked at her. "I know." There was a short pause as the reality of the logistics settled over them. Bob drained the last of his pint and wiped foam from his lip. He turned to George, his expression serious. "Okay, we're committing to the rent. We're buying the paint and basic supplies. But let's be honest, none of it works without the instruments. Realistically, George, what are the chances he actually says yes?" The table went quiet. All eyes turned to George. "He likes to look benevolent," George said, choosing his words carefully. "If I pitch it right, as a win for the school's reputation, he'll struggle to refuse. It makes him look good without costing him a penny." "And if he doesn't bite?" Grimshaw asked, for once without a smile. "If he decides the optics aren't right?" "Then we improvise," George said. Bob sighed, rubbing his forehead. "If we're scraping the barrel, God help us. I've got 2 violins in the loft. One is missing a string and smells like marmalade, but it plays." Mackenzie rubbed his temples. "So that's the contingency. A marmalade violin and Grimshaw's bongos? We'll sound less like an orchestra and more like a nervous breakdown." A ripple of laughter went round the table, but it was thin. The reality hung heavy in the air. George looked at them. They were ready. They just needed the tools. "We won't need the marmalade violin," he said. "I'm not coming out of that office empty-handed." Margaret touched his arm, a silent show of support, but her eyes were anxious. Mackenzie met George's gaze across the table. He didn't offer a speech or a smile. He simply gave a single, slow nod, the kind of look passed between men who had served together, saying, "I trust you without needing the words." Even Grimshaw kept quiet, offering a small, respectful salute with his empty glass. The silence held for a moment, solid and shared. "Right then," Bob said, finally breaking the spell as he stood up. "I'll see you all next Saturday at the hall, 10 sharp." He buttoned his coat, businesslike as ever. "I'll make a start on the admin and get the cleaning supplies ordered. I'll be in touch if I need anything before then." "Thank you, Bob," Margaret said warmly. "See you there," Mackenzie added, gathering his notebook. Grimshaw finished his drink in one gulp. "Night all. Try not to dream of mould." They headed out into the night, the rain slick on the pavement. George watched them go, the weight of it settling on his shoulders. The hall was easy. The cleaning was easy. But Monday morning would decide everything.